Hello and welcome to Security Talks. If you've been here before, welcome back. If this is your first time watching a Security Talks video, thanks for joining. Today we're going to be talking about a very interesting and important security concept, and that is denial of service attacks. So strap yourself in because we're about to embark on a technical deep dive. In the early hours of the morning of Friday the 21st of October 2016, Americans were waking up to find that pretty much all of their favorite websites were completely down. From Twitter to the New York Times, Spotify to Amazon, the outage was immense. This was an unfortunate day for the internet dwellers of America, especially those on the eastern coast. Because even as the first outage was resolved, although 2.5 hours later than it was announced, there was another outage from noon and one more at 4 p.m. So this resulted in almost 6 or 7 hours of downtime within a 12-hour period. Yes, it may seem annoying, but not really anything to be concerned about. But for the companies in question, it meant hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue lost, all in the one unfortunate day. So this is a prime example of our topic today, denial of service attacks. In fact, it's actually the most prime example of all, seeing as it's the largest of its kind. And it truly opened our eyes to how vulnerable the technology around us is. If you're interested in how something so damaging was orchestrated, keep watching, because today's episode will explain how denial of service attacks happen from the ground up from a technical perspective. There are a lot of different types of network attacks. There's brute force attacks. Brute force attacks are basically when a software is used to just guess random combinations of passwords and usernames in an attempt to break into a system. There's also browser-based attacks, which force the user to download malicious software onto their local computer. As well as that, there's the shell shock attacks. Shell shock is a privileged escalation vulnerability which allows users of a system to execute commands that they shouldn't be allowed to do. The largest of all network attacks, however, according to a 2015 report from McAfee Labs, is the denial of service attack, and it makes up almost 40% of all attacks in 2015. So what exactly is a denial of service attack? So imagine you need to buy something from a store, but there's this malicious crowd that they don't really want to purchase anything, but all they do is just continually enter the store and fill up the store until there's no space for you to stand inside. So you have to wait outside for the crowd to reduce. This is conceptually what a denial of service attack looks like. In a simple denial of service attack, or DOS, all of these requests would be potentially coming from one IP address, which would be easily dealt with the server. The server could simply just block this one IP address and prevent it from being serviced. At this point, the attacker might switch to using a distributed DOS attack, where thousands of unique IPs are used, and the server can't actually resolve which are malicious and which aren't, so it has to serve all of them. This is usually done either through simply spoofing the IPs or establishing a botnet and sending all of those requests from different types of bots. Now, let's say if our attacker was particularly well endowed, for example, in the resources, time, or skill sectors, for example, the government, they could actually execute an advanced persistent DOS. While these advanced persistent DOS attacks usually use application layer floods such as HTTP, they are usually also accompanied by some network layer floods and also sometimes SQL injections and cross-site scripting attacks. This type of attacker will also have the resources to use multiple attack vectors. But what are attack vectors? We can safely separate them into two types: application layer attacks and network layer attacks. Application layer attacks usually look to overload a server by sending resource-intensive requests that will eat up the CPU time on the server. These attacks are normally measured in requests per second, and about 50 to 100 requests per second is enough to take down most mid-sized websites. Some examples of attack vectors are HTTP floods, where legitimate looking GET or POST requests are sent to the server, And this actually is a pretty complex type of attack which requires an in-depth knowledge of the application or site you're attacking. But it comes with the added benefit of having low bandwidth, so you can actually execute more requests per second than you would with other attack vectors. DNS floods are also a type of application layer attack vectors. They seek to overwhelm a DNS server to the point where valid requests can no longer be served. These sorts of attacks usually send DNS servers malformed packets from spoofed IP addresses to eat up the processing time. And in the case of an NX domain flood attack, these packets will contain data requesting non-existent or invalid resources, and the DNS server will eat up its processing time trying to find these, and then it will have to send back a response saying it can't find it. In this way, the server uses up pretty much all of its processing power and also fills its cache with bad requests that serve no actual useful purpose. In a DNS server, the cache is actually used to speed up the process of retrieving the relevant IPs that the user is requesting. If the DNS server's cache is filled up with bad requests that completely aren't relevant to any of its users, all of the users using that DNS server will actually experience like a larger latency because the server will have to go through and find the IP addresses in a longer way. The last big type of application layer attack is called RUDY. It's an acronym for Are You Dead Yet? This is an interesting type of slow attack tool that will browse the target website for a form, and when it finds the form, it will send the website a HTTP post request with a very long content length. And because of the way the server works, the server won't actually be able to shut down the connection until it receives enough data to fill up this content length. When it comes to filling the form with information, the tool will actually send bite-sized packets of data to the server with about 10 seconds in between each one, perhaps less or more to make it less predictable. And this means that it's going to take ages for all of the data to be transferred in order to satisfy the content length specification. So naturally, this will create a massive backlog of application threads on the server, and it will completely exhaust the server connection table, causing the server to crash. So those are the main types of application layer attacks. Now moving on to the network layer attacks. These types of attacks are measured completely differently. They're actually measured in gigabits per second, or sometimes packets per second. Large attacks can go up to about 200 gigabits per second, while average attacks are generally between 20 to 40 gigabits per second, and that is still plenty to take down most infrastructures. The first of these is a UDP flood. It's connectionless and sessionless, and it stands for User Datagram Protocol. UDP is designed to not require a three-way handshake like TCP, and it's used generally for things like chats where you don't need to confirm every request being legitimate. However, this property also makes it a very useful tool for DOS attacks. So the UDP packet is filled with meaningless information and sent to the host. When the host receives the packet, it will parse it and try to find an application that is relevant to the datagram it's parsed out of the UDP packet. But since the datagram is completely meaningless, the host will never be able to find an application relevant to the data, and it will be always forced to send back a packet called destination unreachable. With enough of these packets, the server gets completely overwhelmed and won't actually be able to serve any actual legitimate requests. However, network layer DOS attacks also work with the three-way handshake required for a TCP SYN connection. The three-way handshake works as followed. 1. The client will send a synchronized message, also known as SYN, to the server. The server will reply with a synchronized acknowledged or SYN-ACK message, and then it will wait upon the client for the client to send back a acknowledge or ACK message. And after that is done, the connection will be established and data flow will be able to happen between the server and the client. The way this attack works is that the attacker will send SYN requests to all of the ports in the network, and then the server will send back the SYN acknowledged message. But in this case, the attacker will actually just simply ignore this acknowledged message and never complete the third step. The server will be forced to stay open for a while until it times out, waiting for this third step to be completed. So while the server waits for the acknowledged message to return, the port will be left open and more SYN packets will arrive and leave more ports open, and as such, all of the ports will be left open and no actual connections can happen because all of the ports are waiting to time out. According to this 2016 Encapsula report, TCP/SYN and UDP attacks are actually among some of the very most popular types of DOS attacks. Now, how does this all relate to and explain the outage of October 2015? First, you need to understand a few things. The target of this company was DYN, spelled D-Y-N. DYN is an internet performance company, but the product most relevant to this attack is their domain registration service. They provide DNS servers for their clients, which map internet domain names to their respective numerical addresses. If you want to learn more about DNS, I've provided a few links in the description of videos that go into greater depth of how DNS actually works. Simplistically, when you type a URL into your browser, your computer will go talk to your internet service provider's DNS server, and then that DNS server will look at its cache and make sure it doesn't have the result you're looking for already stored locally. If not, it will talk to a conglomeration of root servers that make up the domain name system, and it will ask them where or on what server it can find the IP you're looking for. Then your local internet service provider's DNS server will send a request to this new DNS server that it knows has the IP you're looking for. And once it receives the packet, it will actually just send it back to your browser, and your browser will receive the data and display it to you. Now, this entire process happens faster than you can blink. Secondly, but equally as important, you need to understand the concept of botnets, or specifically the Mirai botnet. So Mirai actually is Japanese for future, and that's quite aptly named because the Mirai malware's main source of victims is those devices that are classified under the Internet of Things category. So the Mirai malware will actually infect these devices and turn them into remotely controlled bots, also called a zombie army. So the main vulnerability it looks for is online devices such as remote cameras or routers that have an outdated version of Linux installed. When it infects these devices, it will usually monitor a singular command server, which will send it information about who, when, and how to attack. A botnet allows for greater bandwidth in your attack, and it also thwarts some of the anti-DOS software that actually just looks for patterns in IP addresses and weird traffic that it can't explain, and then just blocks those IPs. But since you have a large botnet with potentially tens of thousands of IPs, it won't be able to detect any strange pattern in traffic. The attack on DYN's DNS server in 2016 was a really complex and sophisticated attack, but analysts have been able to narrow it down, and it appears that most of the packets were actually just masked TCP and UDP packets. Now, if you remember, the TCP connection was the one that required a three-way handshake, and UDP was connectionless. The Mirai botnet actually set up by the attacker was confirmed to be the source of most of these packets, and DYN has actually confirmed that it had received packets from multiple thousands of IP addresses. The observation of the TCP attacks showed that the packet inflow was 40 to 50 times the usual amount. And some sources have actually stated that at the peak there were about 1.2 terabits of data coming in per second. If the DNS server is a phone book, a DOS attack is the act of ripping it up. This attack really threw internet security and the concept of Internet of Things right under the spotlight. It has been speculated that the motivation for this attack was simply as a test and greater attacks are still to come. But for now, it actually just remains a story in history that will remind us forever of how really vulnerable technology is to all sorts of attacks. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Security Talks. If you have any suggestions for future episodes, or you simply have some advice to share, please do comment below. I'd love to read your comments. I had a lot of fun. Thank you so much for joining me. See you sometime soon.